Hey everyone, welcome to the Modern Traveler Podcast from Oakland Travel. I'm Patrick, your host. With this new podcast, we'll share some tips and tricks for planning your next vacation, whether it be a cruise or a land vacation. For our first episode, we're going to focus on Alaska, on one of the mass market cruise lines such as Royal Caribbean Princess Cruises and Holland America. We've been to Alaska on 2 different cruise lines and learned a few things along the way. For a little bit of background on an Alaska cruise, let's start with one of the most important aspects to consider. Alaska actually has a cruising season. When you think about where it's located, it kind of makes sense. With the time zones, the temperatures, and times for sunrise and sunset, spring and summer are really the only options. The season will usually start around the middle of May and end at the middle of September. Many of the seasonal workers will travel to Alaska and work there and live there during the cruising season, and then of course travel back home to the lower 48 once the winter months set in. Another unusual aspect of cruising to Alaska is the requirement for a stop in Canada. Under the Passenger Vessel Services Act of 1886, only cruise ships that are U.S. flagged, U.S. crewed, U.S. owned, and U.S. built may transport passengers from U.S. ports and back. This criterion eliminates all modern mass market cruise ships, with the exception of one ship by NCL, but that ship is currently designated for Hawaii. Because of these restrictions, cruise ships departing from U.S. ports must stop in a foreign country as part of the itinerary, or the cruise line faces a fine of $798 per passenger. This requirement for a stop in Canada doesn't mean much to most cruise passengers, and they probably don't know about the requirement due to U.S. law. It does, however, place an extra burden on the cruise lines when planning itineraries. The law has been in place before the start of passenger cruising as we know it, so the cruise lines have incorporated it from the start. And now we get to the good stuff. As a general statement at the time of this podcast, the mass market cruise lines for an Alaska cruise consist of Royal Caribbean, Holland America, Princess Cruises, and Celebrity Cruises. The itineraries offered will feature some combination of the following destinations in Alaska: Juneau, Sitka, Hubbard Glacier, Glacier Bay, Ketchikan, Icy Point Strait, Dawes Glacier, Skagway, and Victoria, British Columbia. Also, at the time of this podcast, the itineraries can be grouped into 4 categories: a Seattle round-trip cruise, usually 7 nights, a Vancouver round-trip cruise, usually 7 nights, a Northbound passage cruise, usually 7 nights, and a Southbound passage cruise, also usually 7 nights. We'll start with the Seattle round-trip cruise. This one usually will depart from the Smith Cove Cruise Terminal. As you can see from Google Maps and some of the videos from our August 2019 cruise on the Ovation to the Seas from Royal Caribbean, the terminal area is very small and not designed well for the flow of vehicles dropping passengers off for embarkation or picking them up after disembarkation. The terminal can accommodate 2 cruise ships at a time, and when thousands of passengers leave the ships at the end of the vacation and thousands more arrive for the start of their cruise vacation, it quickly turns into a mess. Some of the ships that you're likely to see cruising from Seattle at the time of this podcast include the Celebrity Edge, the Discovery Princess, Majestic Princess, and Grand Princess from Princess Cruises, of course, the Westerdam Eurodam from Holland America, Quantum of the Seas and Ovation of the Seas from Royal Caribbean, and the Norwegian Encore and Norwegian Bliss. This is obviously subject to change in the coming years as new cruise ships come online and some of these other ships reposition to other parts of the world. A 7-night round-trip cruise out of Seattle does have a few pluses to it. There are many options to choose from in terms of ships, cruise lines, and itineraries. If you've previously cruised out of Seattle to Alaska, maybe another cruise could be considered to try different itineraries that feature destinations you didn't get to visit on your previous cruise or cruises. The Seattle Airport, known as SeaTac, is a nice modern airport with its location in the northwestern of the United States. It offers many nonstop flights to other major U.S. cities. If you decide to add a pre- or post-cruise extension for a few days, there are many things to do and many places to visit. Our recommendation is Viator.com. We are not paid to include them in this podcast. It's just a personal recommendation after many years of very positive experiences with them. If you search for Seattle on Viator.com, you'll find that excursions and tours focus on everything from food, wine, and chocolate to cultural highlights of the Seattle Center, home of the Space Needle and the Chewy Garden and Glass. Tours for outdoor adventures visit famously gorgeous areas such as Mount Rainier, Squamish Falls, and Olympic National Park. And some even go as far as the faux Bavarian town of Leavenworth. There are two negatives to a round-trip cruise from Seattle. The previously mentioned Smith Cove Cruise Terminal can be very frustrating on a busy embarkation day, so you'll want to be prepared and wear your patience hat. The other negative is that with only a 7-night itinerary, a round trip from Seattle can only go as far north as about Skagway before the need to return to Seattle. For our 2019 cruise on the Ovation of the Seas, we had a great time on the cruise in general, but the last 2 days included a sea day and, of course, the required stop in Victoria, British Columbia. I have nothing against Victoria, but I would prefer a visit to Ketchikan instead, or a cruise through the College Fjord, which is too far north for a round trip from Seattle and only 7 nights. Alaska cruises can be very popular depending on your budget, desired destinations on the itinerary, hometown, and a variety of other factors. Seattle could be just the ticket for your next Alaska cruise. Our second option is a round trip from Vancouver, British Columbia in Canada. These cruises usually run as 7 nights, and they embark from a beautiful facility known as Canada Place. With the cruise terminal on the lower levels, Canada Place has its own hotel and convention space, and it's very easy to take a rideshare to the terminal from a hotel in the downtown Vancouver area. For our May 2024 cruise on the Sapphire Princess from Princess Cruises, we stayed at the big Marriott Hotel that was within walking distance of the Canada Place cruise terminal. While not featuring as many cruise ships as Seattle, at the time of this podcast, you're likely to see the following ships embarking from Vancouver on a round-trip 7-night cruise. The Brilliance of the Seas from Royal Caribbean, the Koningsdam, Noordam, and Zandam from Holland America, and the Celebrity Solstice from Celebrity Cruises. As with the Seattle option, a round-trip cruise from Vancouver has several pluses to it. Downtown Vancouver is absolutely beautiful. It's very clean and modern, and it feels safe to walk around and enjoy the city. Many things are within walking distance of the major hotels and the waterfront. I just mentioned Canada Place. It's a very nice option for a cruise terminal, and it's fairly easy to navigate once you arrive. Vancouver offers many options for a pre- or post-cruise extension to your cruise. And similar to Seattle, we recommend Viator.com. When checking the site for Vancouver, you'll find excursions and tours that make it easy to see the highlights of the city by bus, get the chance to spot whales in the area, or visit beloved attractions such as the Capilano Suspension Bridge or sprawling Stanley Park. There are loads of options that will get you out of town too, to popular nearby destinations such as BC's capital city of Victoria and the celebrated ski town of Whistler. I only have one negative with a round-trip cruise out of Vancouver. Like Seattle, the cruise would only be able to go as far north such as Skagway before turning around for the return trip. Also, like Seattle, depending on what kind of cruise you're looking for, this may be fine. Our third option is what I'm going to call the Northbound Passage. These cruises will always start in Vancouver and end in either Whittier or Seward, Alaska, depending on the cruise line, of course. As of the recording of this podcast, some of the cruise ships that you're likely to see cruising the Northbound Passage would include the Grand Princess, Sapphire Princess, and Royal Princess from Princess Cruises, the Celebrity Summit from Celebrity Cruises, Radiance of the Seas from Royal Caribbean, the Noordam and the Noy Amsterdam from Holland America, and the Norwegian Jewel. As mentioned before, this list is subject to change as new cruise ships come online, and some of these existing ships reposition to other parts of the world. Similar to the previous options, the Northbound Passage has several pluses to it. Since these cruises start in Vancouver, everything I mentioned earlier about Vancouver itself is a plus. The downtown area, the cruise terminal, hotel availability, etc. Fly in early and make Vancouver the pre-cruise extension to your vacation. We did that in May 2024, sort of. We arrived the night before following the usual cruise advice. Still, when our cruise embarkation was delayed for a few hours due to a mechanical issue on the ship, we had the morning of embarkation to walk around and take in the downtown area by the hotel and by Canada Place, the cruise terminal. Another plus is that, in my opinion, the Northbound Passage, you see more of Alaska by not having to turn around and return south for the second half of the cruise. A good example of this would be the northern areas of the itinerary, such as the College Fjord that we saw on the Sapphire Princess in May of 2024. There are a couple of negatives to consider with this cruise option. The first of these concerns the end of the cruise. Both Whittier and Seward are tiny and require a journey to Anchorage, Alaska to fly home. This will likely mean you're one of the first ones off the ship, so be prepared to get up early on the morning of disembarkation. The most widely available option to get up to Anchorage is by coach, which was well organized when we did it on our Sapphire Princess cruise. If time isn't much of a factor, depending on your flight home, the Alaska Railroad has train service from both Whittier and Seward to Anchorage. The website describes the train ride as a nice scenic option. The second negative for this option for an Alaska cruise deals with the flights home. Flight availability from Anchorage can be limited due to time zone, location, distance, etc. Depending on where you're flying to, and a connecting flight may be involved. Between the early morning disembarkation from the ship, the time to travel to Anchorage by coach or rail, the departure time of your first flight, layover in another airport, and then the final flight home, your last day of the cruise vacation could be a long travel day. In May 2024, we walked off the Sapphire Princess in Whittier, Alaska at around 7 a.m. Alaska time, and didn't get home to the house in Orlando until 6:30 in the morning the following morning. The final negative isn't much of a problem, it's just kind of an observation. When researching Alaska cruise options over the last few years, I've noticed that the Northbound Passage option has less capacity than round-trip cruises from Seattle or Vancouver. Princess Cruises and Holland America are the two main options, and they only run a few ships on this route. This could change in the coming years as other cruise lines decide to expand into Alaska or change their cruise itinerary offerings. And the fourth option to cover in this podcast is, of course, the Southbound Passage. As you might have guessed, it's the opposite of the Northbound Passage, where the ships embark from either Whittier or Seward and disembark in Vancouver at the Canada Place Cruise Terminal. As of the time of this podcast, the ships that you're likely to see running this route include the Noordam from Holland America, the Nooi Amsterdam from Holland America, the Grand Princess, Sapphire Princess, and Royal Princess from Princess Cruises. As with the previous three options, this option has both pluses and minuses. Starting with the pluses, of course, the Southbound Passage will have a similar experience to the Northbound Passage, where you see more of Alaska, but only, of course, in the opposite direction. When the ship doesn't have to spend days returning to the same embarkation port, it can make a big difference on the itinerary. The second positive is the option to do the trip back to back. This one never occurred to us until we met some fellow passengers on the Sapphire Princess who told us they were returning to Vancouver while we were getting off the ship to head up to Anchorage to fly home. The idea of a back-to-back cruise from Vancouver would obviously mean you'd have to stay on the ship for 14 days and of course afford the cost of the two cruises together. One possible side benefit to doing this, albeit a small one, is that the round-trip flights to and from Vancouver might be a better option than a one-way flight into Vancouver to start the cruise and then a one-way flight home from Anchorage at the end of the cruise. With the Southbound Passage, there are a couple of negatives. Similar to the Northbound Passage, there's not as much inventory. Princess Cruises and Holland America are the two main cruise lines that cruise between Whittier, Seward, and Vancouver, and those southbound routes are the opposite of the Northbound Passage. Given the duration of the cruising season in general, there are only so many cruises that run this Southbound Passage every year. The second negative here was the deciding factor for us when planning our May 2024 cruise. Assuming you don't do back-to-back and your only cruise would disembark from either Whittier or Seward, you would need to fly into Anchorage the day before the cruise and stay overnight before traveling to the cruise port the morning of embarkation. When I researched what it would look like for us to leave Orlando, Florida, and embark from Whittier on Princess Cruises, the logistics just didn't seem that good. On the other hand, if you choose to make Anchorage a pre-cruise extension to your vacation, the idea of embarking from Whittier or Seward could be a pro instead of a con, so it depends on your travel plans. Those are what I would consider the four main options for a mass market cruise to Alaska. There are other options for cruising to Alaska, of course, on smaller ships from luxury or expedition-based cruise lines. Some examples would include Lindblad Expeditions has partnered with National Geographic to provide Alaska expedition cruises. They embark from Juneau and disembark in Ketchikan, and of course vice versa. They usually run around 6 days, and they start about $4,000 for just the cruise with no flights. Herdegruen Expeditions, hopefully I'm saying that right. For them, I found a huge 13-day expedition from Seward to Vancouver. The cruise fare starts around $5,000 per person with no airfare. For Oceania, I found cruises between Whittier and Vancouver, 8 days with a cost of around $3,000 per guest with no airfare, and 12 days with a cost of around $4,300 per guest with no airfare. For Crystal Cruises, I found a cruise between Seward and Vancouver, 7 nights. I also found a 14-night that goes from Vancouver to Skagway, Alaska, then down to Los Angeles with plenty of stops along the way. For an Alaska cruise, be sure to do your due diligence and plan carefully. Take into account the month you'll be going. June and July are the two busiest months. Remember to research and book your travel insurance. Spend lots of time researching the shore excursions available. Plan through the logistics of how you're going to make the most of the hours in port at each of the port stops. Research the clothes you'll need. There are countless YouTube videos on what to pack for Alaska. Make sure that everyone has a valid passport with at least 6 months left before the renewal date at the start of the cruise. And of course, remember to bring some cash for tips for crew members or local vendors in the Alaska towns. Thank you so much for watching this podcast. Make sure you're subscribed to the Oakland Travel YouTube channel with the notification bell on so you don't miss any of the new content. And we'll see you in the next video.